Prepare yourself for a journey beyond the ordinary, into the shadows of your deepest fears. Welcome to the world of Mr. Scary Guy. I've always been comfortable staying home alone. Even as a kid, I never felt the need to have someone around. But what happened to me last fall changed everything. It was a crisp October evening. The leaves had turned golden, and a cool breeze rustled through the trees. My parents were away for the weekend, visiting relatives upstate. I had the house to myself, which meant a weekend of binge-watching horror movies, ordering takeout, and staying up late playing video games. Little did I know, my life was about to take a turn for the terrifying. Our house is on the outskirts of town, surrounded by woods. It's a peaceful place, perfect for someone who enjoys solitude. On that particular Friday night, I was curled up on the couch, engrossed in a classic horror movie. The lights were off, the only illumination coming from the flickering screen and the occasional flash of lightning outside. As the movie neared its climax, I heard a noise. It was faint at first, a soft tapping sound coming from the back of the house. I paused the movie and strained to listen. The tapping continued, rhythmic and deliberate. My first thought was that it was just a branch tapping against the window, swayed by the wind. I decided to check it out, just to be sure. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, making my way through the darkened house. The tapping grew louder as I approached the back door. When I reached the kitchen, I could see the back porch light flickering through the window. It was strange because I hadn't turned it on. Taking a deep breath, I unlocked the door and stepped outside. The cold air hit me, sending a shiver down my spine. I scanned the porch with my flashlight, but there was nothing unusual. No branches, no animals, nothing. Just as I was about to go back inside, the tapping started again, this time louder and more insistent. The sound was coming from the side of the house. I followed it, my heart pounding in my chest. As I rounded the corner, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, etched into the wooden siding, were 3 deep scratches. They were fresh, the wood splintered and raw. Fear crept into my mind. What could have made those marks? A bear? But there were no bears in this area. Maybe a raccoon. But raccoons don't make scratches like that. I decided it was best to go back inside and lock the doors. Once back in the safety of the house, I double-checked all the locks and closed all the blinds. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease and returned to the living room. The movie had lost its appeal, so I switched to playing video games instead. Hours passed, and the strange incident began to fade from my mind. Around midnight, I decided to call it a night. I turned off the TV and headed upstairs to my bedroom. As I climbed the stairs, I felt a strange sensation like I was being watched. I glanced back, but there was nothing there. Shaking my head, I continued to my room, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. I got ready for bed and slid under the covers, my mind still racing from the evening's events. I was just starting to drift off when I heard it again. The tapping. This time, it was coming from my window. My bedroom is on the 2nd floor, so there was no way it could be a branch or an animal. I sat up, my heart pounding in my ears. The tapping continued, steady and insistent. Summoning all my courage, I got out of bed and approached the window. I pulled back the curtain, and my heart nearly stopped. There, standing on the roof outside my window, was a figure. It was a man, dressed in dark clothing, his face obscured by a hood. He was staring right at me, his eyes glinting in the moonlight. I froze, unable to move or scream. The man raised a hand and tapped on the window again, his eyes never leaving mine. Finally, I found my voice and screamed. I stumbled back, grabbing my phone and dialing 911. The operator answered, and I frantically explained what was happening. She assured me that the police were on their way and told me to stay on the line. I stayed in the corner of my room, clutching the phone like a lifeline. The man outside continued to tap on the window, his expression never changing. Minutes felt like hours, but eventually, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. The man turned his head, looking in the direction of the approaching police cars. Then, without a word, he turned and disappeared into the night. I stayed on the phone with the operator until the police arrived. They searched the area but found no sign of the man. They took my statement and promised to patrol the area throughout the night. The rest of the weekend passed in a blur. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. I kept seeing that man's face every time I closed my eyes. My parents came home on Sunday evening and I told them everything. They were understandably shaken and promised to get a security system installed. For a while, things returned to normal. The security system gave me a sense of safety and I started to sleep better. But then, about a month later, I found something that shattered my fragile sense of security. It was a Saturday morning and I was raking leaves in the backyard. As I worked, I noticed something glinting in the sunlight near the edge of the woods. Curious, I walked over and found a small metal object partially buried in the dirt. I picked it up and brushed off the soil. It was a key, a very old, ornate key. As I examined it, a chill ran down my spine. I recognized it. It was the key to our house. The old key that had been replaced when we moved in, but kept as a memento. It had been missing for months and we had assumed it was lost. I stared at the key, my mind racing. How did it end up here? Had the man taken it? Had he been in our house before? The thought made my blood run cold. I ran inside and showed the key to my parents. They were as shocked as I was and called the police again. The police came and took the key as evidence. They searched the house and the surrounding area but found nothing. Days turned into weeks, and there were no more incidents. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the man was still out there watching, waiting. Then, one night, I had a dream. I was in my room, and the man was outside my window again. But this time, he wasn't tapping. He was holding up a sign. I couldn't read it at first, but as he moved closer, the words became clear. It said, "I'm inside." I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart racing. I knew it was just a dream, but it felt so real. I got up and checked all the locks in the security system. Everything was secure, but the feeling of unease wouldn't go away. The next morning, I went to the police station to check on the investigation. The officer in charge told me they had no new leads. I thanked him and left, feeling more anxious than ever. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing the tapping in my mind, seeing the man's face. I decided to get up and get some water. As I walked down the hallway, I noticed a light coming from under the attic door. I knew I hadn't left it on. I hesitated, my heart pounding. Slowly, I climbed the stairs to the attic and pushed the door open. The light was coming from a small, dusty lamp in the corner, and next to it was a notebook. I picked up the notebook and flipped through it. My blood ran cold as I read the entries. They were detailed descriptions of my daily activities, written in a neat, precise hand. The last entry was dated the night the man had appeared at my window. Suddenly, I heard a noise behind me. I turned, and there he was, the man from my window standing in the doorway, his eyes glinting in the dim light. He smiled, a slow, chilling smile. "I told you," he said, his voice a low whisper. "I'm inside." I screamed and tried to run, but he was faster. He grabbed me, his grip like iron. I struggled, but it was no use. The last thing I remember is his cold, empty eyes staring into mine. When I woke up, I was in a hospital bed. The police told me they had found me unconscious in the attic, the man nowhere to be found. They said it was a miracle I was alive, but I knew better. He had let me live, for now. To this day, I don't know who he was or why he chose me, but I do know one thing. I'll never feel safe in my own home again, because he's still out there, watching, waiting, and one day he'll come back. I never imagined that my part-time job at the local morgue would lead to the most terrifying experience of my life. It all began when I was hired as a night attendant, a role that seemed simple enough: manage the front desk, log in new arrivals, and ensure the place was secure overnight. The first few nights were uneventful, but it didn't take long for the eerie atmosphere to start playing tricks on my mind. The building itself was ancient, with creaky wooden floors and walls that seemed to whisper in the silence. My station was at the front, where a single dim light barely illuminated the desk. Behind me, the long hallway stretched into darkness, lined with rooms for autopsies and body storage. Every creak and groan of the old structure set my nerves on edge. On my fifth night, something strange happened. I was logging in a new arrival, an elderly woman who had passed away from natural causes. As I wheeled the gurney into the cold storage room, I felt a sudden drop in temperature, far colder than usual. The overhead lights flickered, casting eerie shadows on the tiled walls. I quickly finished my task and hurried back to the front desk, my heart racing. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was as if unseen eyes were following my every move. I tried to dismiss it as paranoia, but the sensation grew stronger with each passing hour. Around 3 a.m., I heard a faint knocking sound coming from one of the storage rooms. I froze, my mind racing with possibilities. Mustering up my courage, I grabbed a flashlight and made my way down the hallway. As I approached the source of the noise, the knocking grew louder, more insistent. I stopped in front of the storage room where the elderly woman's body had been placed. The door was slightly ajar, and the cold air seeped out like an invisible fog. I pushed the door open and shone my flashlight inside. The room was empty, except for the metal drawers lining the walls. The knocking had stopped, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. I was about to leave when I noticed something odd. One of the drawers was slightly open, not enough to see inside, but enough to suggest that it hadn't been closed properly. My hands trembled as I reached for the handle and pulled it open. The drawer was empty. Panic surged through me as I checked the logbook. The elderly woman's body was supposed to be here. I slammed the drawer shut and backed out of the room, my mind reeling. I returned to the front desk and tried to calm myself down, telling myself that there had to be a logical explanation, but deep down I knew something was very wrong. The next night I was reluctant to return to work, but I couldn't afford to lose the job. I arrived earlier than usual, hoping to talk to the day shift attendant about the missing body, but he had already left. As the night wore on, the oppressive feeling of being watched returned, stronger than ever. Every creak and groan of the old building seemed amplified, each one sending chills down my spine. Around midnight, the power went out. The entire building was plunged into darkness and the silence was suffocating. I fumbled for my flashlight and turned it on, the weak beam cutting through the thick blackness. I made my way to the generator room, my footsteps echoing in the empty hallways. Just as I reached the generator, I heard a loud crash from the storage room. My blood ran cold as I realized it was the same room where the elderly woman's body had disappeared. I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to leave, but something compelled me to check it out. I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to know what was happening. I crept down the hallway, my flashlight shaking in my hand. As I approached the storage room, I could see that the door was wide open, the cold air pouring out in waves. I stepped inside and immediately noticed that several of the drawers were now open. The room was filled with an overpowering stench of decay, far worse than anything I had ever encountered. In the center of the room stood a figure, hunched and grotesque. It was the elderly woman, her eyes glowing with an unnatural light. She turned to face me, and a chilling smile spread across her lips. "You shouldn't have come back," she whispered, her voice echoing with a sinister edge. I stumbled backward, dropping my flashlight. The beam rolled across the floor, casting wild shadows on the walls. The woman began to move towards me, her movements jerky and unnatural. I scrambled to my feet and ran, the sound of her footsteps echoing behind me. I burst out of the storage room and sprinted down the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear her following me, her breath rasping and labored. I reached the front desk and grabbed the phone, frantically dialing 911. As the operator answered, I heard the woman's voice behind me, closer now. "You can't escape," she hissed. I dropped the phone and ran out of the building, not stopping until I reached my car. I locked the doors and sat there, trembling, as I watched the morgue. The lights flickered back on, but the building remained eerily silent. I waited for what felt like hours, but there was no sign of the woman. The next morning, I quit my job and never looked back. I later learned that the elderly woman had been involved in dark rituals during her lifetime, her death shrouded in mystery. The morgue was eventually shut down, the locals claiming it was haunted. To this day, I can't shake the memory of that night. Every time I close my eyes, I see her face, hear her voice. I don't know what she wanted or why she chose me, but I do know one thing: some things are better left undisturbed. The dead should remain in peace, and the living should never venture into their realm. I've always considered myself a friendly neighbor, the kind who waves hello and shares small talk while checking the mail. But everything changed when the Johnsons moved in next door. It's funny how we can live so close to someone, yet know so little about them. I thought I knew my neighborhood well, but I was wrong. So very wrong. The first time I noticed something off about the Johnsons was one quiet Wednesday evening. I was taking out the trash when I saw Mrs. Johnson staring at me from her window. Her expression was blank, almost as if she was looking through me. It gave me chills. I tried to shrug it off, but her gaze lingered in my mind. The Johnsons' house always seemed darker than the others on the block, even during the day. The windows were perpetually curtained, and I rarely saw anyone go in or out. The few times I did see Mr. Johnson, he was usually dragging something large and heavy into the house. My curiosity got the better of me, and I started paying more attention to their comings and goings. One night I heard strange noises coming from their house. It was a low, rhythmic thumping, like something being dragged across the floor. I pressed my ear against the wall, straining to hear more. Suddenly the noise stopped, and I heard a faint whispering, but I couldn't make out the words. My heart raced, and a sense of dread washed over me. What were they doing in there? I decided to investigate further. I started keeping a journal of their activities, noting down the times I heard noises or saw anything unusual. Days turned into weeks, and the list grew longer. One night, I saw Mr. Johnson digging a hole in their backyard. It was around midnight, and the moon cast eerie shadows across the lawn. He was at it for hours, and I wondered what could possibly require such a deep hole. The next morning I went to the backyard pretending to search for my lost cat. The hole was filled in, but the dirt was freshly turned. Something about it felt wrong, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something sinister was buried there. As the weeks went by, the noises grew louder and more frequent. I started having nightmares about the Johnsons, vivid dreams where I was trapped in their house, unable to escape. In one dream, I found myself in their basement, surrounded by mannequins dressed in old-fashioned clothes. Their eyes seemed to follow me, and I woke up in a cold sweat. Determined to uncover the truth, I installed a small camera facing their house. I checked the footage every night, hoping to catch something that would explain the strange occurrences. For days, nothing happened. Then, one night, I saw Mr. Johnson carrying what looked like a mannequin into the house, but this time it moved. It wasn't a mannequin, it was a person, limp and unconscious. I called the police immediately, but when they arrived, the Johnsons were calm and collected. They let the officers search the house, but they found nothing out of the ordinary. The police left, and I was left feeling helpless and more terrified than ever. I decided to confront them myself. One evening, I mustered up the courage to knock on their door. Mrs. Johnson answered, her eyes as cold and empty as ever. I stammered something about hearing noises and being concerned for their well-being. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. She invited me in, and against my better judgment, I stepped inside. The house was eerily quiet, and the air felt heavy. Mrs. Johnson led me to the living room where Mr. Johnson sat reading a newspaper. He looked up and smiled, but there was something predatory about it. I felt like a lamb being led to slaughter. We exchanged pleasantries, and I tried to bring up the noises I'd heard. They both laughed, dismissing it as old pipes and settling wood. But I wasn't convinced. As I was about to leave, I noticed a door partially hidden behind a curtain. My curiosity got the better of me, and I asked what was behind it. Their smiles faded, and an uncomfortable silence filled the room. Mr. Johnson stood up, blocking my view of the door. "That's just the basement," he said, his voice devoid of any warmth. "Nothing interesting down there." I left their house, my heart pounding. I knew they were hiding something, and I was determined to find out what. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the basement and what might be hidden there. I decided to take matters into my own hands. Armed with a flashlight and a sense of dread, I snuck into their backyard around midnight. The house was dark and silent, and I hoped they were asleep. I found a small window that led to the basement and managed to pry it open. Taking a deep breath, I slipped inside. The basement was cold and musty, filled with old furniture and boxes. As I moved deeper into the room, my flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I stumbled upon a large, old trunk. My hands shook as I opened it, revealing a collection of old clothes and photographs, but something caught my eye. A small, blood-stained doll. My heart raced as I realized the doll's clothes matched the ones from my dream. Panic set in and I turned to leave, but a voice stopped me in my tracks. "I see you found our little secret." I spun around to see Mr. Johnson standing at the top of the stairs, a cruel smile on his face. Mrs. Johnson stood behind him, her eyes devoid of any emotion. They slowly descended the stairs, and I felt a surge of terror. I backed away, but there was nowhere to go. Mr. Johnson grabbed my arm, his grip like iron. "You shouldn't have come here," he hissed. I struggled, but it was futile. They dragged me deeper into the basement, past rows of mannequins. My mind raced, trying to find a way out. They shoved me into a small room and locked the door. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and I realized with horror that the mannequins weren't mannequins at all. They were bodies, preserved and posed like dolls. I screamed, but the walls muffled my cries. Days turned into weeks. They kept me locked in that room, feeding me just enough to keep me alive. I could hear them whispering outside, talking about their plans. I knew I had to escape before it was too late. One night I managed to pick the lock with a piece of wire I'd found. I crept through the basement, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear the Johnsons moving around upstairs, their footsteps echoing through the house. I made it to the window and squeezed through, my body trembling with fear and exhaustion. I ran as fast as I could, not daring to look back. I reached my house and locked the doors, collapsing in a heap on the floor. I called the police again, but by the time they arrived, the Johnsons were gone. Their house was empty, the basement cleared out. It was as if they had never been there. To this day, I don't know who the Johnsons really were or what they were planning, but I can't shake the feeling that they're still out there, watching and waiting. And every night, I sleep with one eye open, fearing that one day they'll come back for me. Let me take you back to the summer of 1994. I was 15 years old, living in a small town where the only exciting place for teenagers was the local arcade. The place was called Game Haven, a neon-lit sanctuary filled with the latest games, the smell of popcorn, and the sound of coins clinking into machines. It was a regular Friday night when things took a turn for the worse, something I'll never forget. My friends and I would usually gather at Game Haven after school. That night it was just me, Justin, and Helen. Justin was a year older, a tall kid with an obsession for high scores, while Helen was the quiet type, always tagging along but never really participating in the games. We were the usual trio. The arcade was unusually empty that night, just a few kids scattered around, and Mr. Lawson, the owner, was behind the counter, his usual grumpy self. We split up, each heading to our favorite machines. I went for Street Fighter 2, Justin was on Pac-Man, and Helen, well, she just wandered around, watching us. About an hour in, something strange happened. I was in the middle of a match when the screen flickered. At first I thought it was just a glitch, but then it went black. I turned to see if anyone else had noticed, but everything seemed normal. I called over Mr. Lawson, who came grumbling, "These damn machines always breaking down." He fiddled with the machine, and after a few minutes, it came back to life. I shrugged it off and continued playing. However, it wasn't long before I noticed something odd. The character on the screen seemed to move on its own, responding before I could even press a button. It was as if the game was reading my mind. I brushed it off as my imagination and moved on to another game. An hour later, we decided to take a break and get some snacks. We met up near the snack counter, but Helen was missing. Justin and I called out for her, assuming she was just somewhere around, but there was no response. We checked all her usual spots, but she was nowhere to be found. Mr. Lawson saw us and asked what was going on. We told him Helen was missing, and he reluctantly agreed to help us look for her. We searched every corner of the arcade, the bathrooms, even the storage room, but there was no sign of her. As we were about to give up, a man walked in. He was in his mid-40s, wearing a trench coat, which was odd considering it was the middle of summer. He had a peculiar aura about him, something that made me uneasy. He went straight to the back of the arcade, where the old, rarely used games were. Justin and I decided to follow him, hoping he might have seen Helen. We watched from a distance as he stopped in front of an old game called Polybius. I had never seen anyone play that game before. It was rumored to be one of those urban legends, the kind you hear about but never believe. The man started the game, and the screen lit up with strange symbols and flashing lights. He seemed entranced, his eyes glued to the screen. Justin and I looked at each other, unsure of what to do. Suddenly, the man turned around and stared directly at us, his eyes cold and lifeless. "Looking for your friend?" he asked in a monotone voice. We nodded, too scared to speak. "She's here," he said, pointing to the screen. We looked and saw Helen's face flash on the screen for a split second. I felt a chill run down my spine. The man smirked and turned back to the game. Justin and I didn't know what to do. We wanted to confront him, but something about him was terrifying. We decided to find Mr. Lawson instead. We ran to the front of the arcade and told Mr. Lawson about the man in the game. He seemed skeptical but agreed to check it out. When we got back to the Polybius machine, the man was gone and the game was turned off. Mr. Lawson tried to reassure us, saying it was probably just a prank. But Justin and I knew something was wrong. Determined to find Helen, we decided to search the arcade one more time. As we walked past the Polybius machine, it suddenly turned on by itself. The screen displayed the words, "Play to find her." Justin and I exchanged nervous glances, but we knew we had no choice. We took turns playing the game. The controls were strange, and the graphics were unlike anything I had ever seen. It felt as if the game was messing with our minds. Each level we completed showed us brief glimpses of Helen looking scared and lost. Hours passed and we were exhausted. Justin was starting to lose it, muttering about how the game was alive. I tried to keep him focused, but deep down I felt the same fear. The game seemed endless, each level more twisted and disturbing than the last. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we reached a level that looked different. Instead of the usual maze and puzzles, it was a dark, empty room. In the center of the room was Helen, tied to a chair, her face pale and eyes wide with fear. We heard footsteps behind us and turned to see the strange man from before. "Congratulations," he said, his voice echoing in the empty arcade. "You've found her." Justin lunged at him, but the man was unnaturally fast. He grabbed Justin by the throat and lifted him off the ground effortlessly. I stood frozen, unable to move. The man looked at me, his eyes piercing into mine. "You can have her back, but there's a price." I didn't understand what he meant, but I knew I had no choice. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice trembling. He smiled, a cold, cruel smile. "Your life for hers," he said simply. Before I could react, the man released Justin, who fell to the floor gasping for air. The man approached me and I felt a coldness spread through my body. He placed a hand on my shoulder and I felt an intense pain, as if my very soul was being ripped apart. Suddenly the arcade lights flickered and everything went black. When I woke up, I was lying on the floor of the arcade. The sun was rising outside, casting a dim light through the windows. Justin was beside me, shaking me awake. "We have to get out of here," he said urgently. I looked around, disoriented. The arcade was empty and there was no sign of the strange man or Helen. We stumbled out of the arcade and into the daylight, not stopping until we were far away. Later that day, we went back to the arcade with the police. Mr. Lawson was furious, demanding to know what we were doing there so early. We told them everything, but there was no evidence of anything strange. The Polybius machine was gone, and there was no sign of Helen. The police didn't believe us, and Mr. Lawson banned us from the arcade for causing trouble. Days turned into weeks, and there was still no sign of Helen. Her disappearance became a local mystery, but Justin and I knew the truth. Years later, I stumbled upon an article about urban legends and found a mention of Polybius. It was described as a game that allegedly caused strange behavior and even disappearances. I knew then that what we experienced was real. To this day, I can't explain what happened that night. I still have nightmares about the strange man in the game. Justin and I drifted apart, unable to cope with the trauma we shared. As for Helen, she was never found. Some nights I swear I can hear her voice calling out from old arcade machines, begging for help. I've never set foot in an arcade since, and I never will. My name is Daniel. I'm a 24-year-old trainee at a law firm, and I've always considered myself to be a pretty normal guy. I had a stable job, a wonderful girlfriend named Jenny, and a decent social life. Life was good, until it all started to unravel because of an innocuous social media platform, Instagram. It all began one evening after work. I was scrolling through Instagram, double-tapping random photos of friends and influencers, when a new follower notification popped up. The username was ShadowWatcher22. The profile picture was a dark, indistinct silhouette, and there were no posts, no followers. It was following only me. At first, I shrugged it off as a bot. I get weird follows now and then, but something about this one felt different. I decided to block the account and move on with my evening. Jenny and I had plans to go out for dinner, so I didn't give it another thought. A few days later, while having lunch at my desk, I received another notification. The same account, ShadowWatcher22, had followed me again. This time I felt a shiver run down my spine. I checked the profile again, still no posts, no followers, and it was still only following me. How had this guy found me again after being blocked? I showed Jenny the account later that night and she laughed it off, calling it a coincidence. But I couldn't shake off the feeling of unease that crept over me. Weeks passed, and the strange account slipped to the back of my mind as work got busier. One Friday night, Jenny and I decided to have a quiet evening at her apartment. We cooked dinner together and settled down to watch a movie. As the movie played, my phone buzzed with a new Instagram notification. Reluctantly, I checked it, only to see that ShadowWatcher22 had followed me again. This time, I didn't block it. Instead, I decided to send a direct message. "Who are you?" I typed, hoping to get some answers. Almost immediately, I received a reply. "I'm always watching." My heart pounded. I showed Jenny the message, and her face went pale. We decided to block the account again, but the unease lingered throughout the weekend. The next few days were uneventful, and I almost managed to forget about the eerie account. Then, one night while I was working late at the office, I received another notification. My heart sank as I saw the now familiar username, ShadowWatcher22, had followed me again. Feeling a mix of anger and fear, I decided to dig deeper. I went through the account's followers and following list again. Nothing had changed. Then, a thought struck me. I started searching for ShadowWatcher22 in various search engines and social media platforms, hoping to find any trace of this person. As I was about to give up, I found a thread on an obscure forum discussing strange Instagram accounts. One post mentioned ShadowWatcher22, describing similar experiences of being followed and harassed. The original poster claimed that their life had turned into a nightmare after blocking the account multiple times. They mentioned experiencing strange occurrences, unexplainable noises, shadows moving in their peripheral vision, and even physical attacks. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. Could this be the same person? I bookmarked the page and hurriedly shut down my computer, eager to get home. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the apartment, every rustle of the trees outside made me jump. I kept my phone beside me, checking it every few minutes. At around 2 a.m., my phone buzzed again. I grabbed it, my hands shaking, and saw the notification. ShadowWatcher22 has followed you. This time there was a message. You can't escape. Panic surged through me. I woke Jenny up, showing her the message. Her eyes widened with fear.
"We need to call the police,"
she said. But what could the police do about an anonymous Instagram account? I decided to contact Instagram's support team, reporting the account for harassment. They assured me they would investigate, but I wasn't convinced it would help. The next day at work, I couldn't focus. My mind kept drifting back to the messages and the ominous feeling that someone was watching me. My coworkers noticed my distracted state and asked if everything was all right, but I couldn't bring myself to explain the bizarre situation. That evening, as I was leaving the office, I noticed something unusual. A man in a dark hoodie was standing across the street, staring directly at me. My heart raced as I quickened my pace, glancing back to see if he was following me. He wasn't, but the unease remained. When I reached Jenny's apartment, I told her about the man. We decided to be extra cautious, making sure all doors and windows were locked. Jenny suggested we stay at her place for a while, thinking it would be safer. Over the next few days, the stalking intensified. Every time I opened Instagram, there was a new message from ShadowWatcher22. The messages grew more sinister. I see you, I know where you live, and you belong to me. Jenny and I decided to take a break from social media, hoping to escape the stalker's grasp. But the respite was short-lived. One night while we were sleeping, I woke up to the sound of whispers. It was faint, barely audible, but it was there. I nudged Jenny awake, and she heard it too. We crept through the apartment, following the sound. It seemed to be coming from the living room. As we approached, the whispering stopped abruptly. We turned on the lights, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. Feeling unnerved, we returned to bed, but sleep eluded us. The following morning, I noticed something chilling. On Jenny's phone, an Instagram notification from ShadowWatcher22 appeared. He had followed her now. Panic set in as we realized the stalker was expanding their reach. Jenny's profile was private, and she only accepted follow requests from people she knew. We couldn't fathom how the stalker had managed to find her account. Desperate, we decided to delete our Instagram accounts, hoping to sever the connection once and for all. For a while, it seemed to work. The messages stopped, and the strange occurrences dwindled. We started to feel a semblance of normalcy returning to our lives. But then one night, everything took a turn for the worse. We were out for a walk, trying to enjoy the crisp evening air, when Jenny received a text message. It was from an unknown number, and the message was a photo. It was a picture of us, taken from a distance while we were walking. Fear gripped us as we realized the stalker wasn't just confined to Instagram. He was physically watching us. We hurried back to Jenny's apartment, our minds racing with paranoia. When we got inside, we locked all the doors and windows and decided to stay put. We called the police and reported the stalking, but without any concrete evidence or a clear identity, there wasn't much they could do. That night, we were awoken by a loud bang from the living room. We bolted out of bed and rushed to see what had happened. The front door was wide open and the lock was broken. Panic surged through us as we searched the apartment, but there was no sign of anyone. We called the police again and they arrived within minutes. They searched the area but found no one. The officer advised us to stay somewhere else for the night, so we decided to go to my place. When we got to my apartment, we found another chilling surprise. My laptop was open on the kitchen table, and the screen displayed my Instagram profile. The account had been reactivated, and there was a new post, a picture of Jenny and me, taken while we were sleeping. Terror washed over us as we realized the stalker had been inside my apartment. The police arrived again, but once more they found no trace of the intruder. The next few days were a blur of fear and anxiety. We stayed with friends, changing locations every night, hoping to shake off the stalker. But no matter where we went, the messages continued. We received texts, emails, and even physical letters, all from Shadow Watcher 22. The letters were the worst. They contained detailed descriptions of our daily activities written in a scrawling, almost manic handwriting. It was clear the stalker was watching us constantly, and their obsession was growing. One letter in particular stood out. It contained a photograph of Jenny, taken from inside her apartment, while she was alone. The realization that the stalker had been inside her home, watching her, was too much to bear. In a desperate bid to end the nightmare, we decided to confront the stalker. We scoured the letters and messages for any clues to their identity, and eventually, we found something. One of the letters mentioned a specific location, a rundown building on the outskirts of town. We debated whether to go to the police with this information, but we were afraid they wouldn't take us seriously. So against our better judgment, we decided to investigate ourselves. We arrived at the building just before sunset. It was an old abandoned warehouse covered in graffiti and surrounded by overgrown weeds. The air was thick with a sense of foreboding as we approached the entrance. Inside, the warehouse was dark and musty. We used our phone flashlights to navigate the maze of debris and broken machinery. As we ventured deeper, we heard a faint sound, whispering. We followed the sound to a small, windowless room at the back of the warehouse. The door was ajar and the whispering grew louder as we approached. My heart pounded in my chest as I pushed the door open. Inside, we found a makeshift shrine. The walls were covered in photographs of Jenny and me, taken from various angles and locations. In the center of the room, there was a small table with a laptop displaying our Instagram profiles. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind us. We spun around to see a figure standing in the doorway, shrouded in darkness. The figure stepped forward and we saw his face for the first time, a twisted, malevolent grin that sent chills down our spines. Before we could react, the figure lunged at us. We fought back, but he was unnaturally strong. In the struggle, I managed to grab a metal pipe and swung it at the figure, knocking him to the ground. We didn't stay to see if he got back up. We ran out of the warehouse, not stopping until we reached the car. We drove straight to the police station, breathless and shaken, and told them everything. The police returned to the warehouse, but the figure was gone. They found the shrine and the photographs, but there was no sign of the stalker. In the days that followed, the messages stopped, and the strange occurrences ceased. We tried to move on with our lives, but the trauma of those events lingered. Jenny and I grew closer, bonded by the ordeal we had survived. But sometimes late at night I still hear whispering, and I can't shake the feeling that somewhere out there, Shadow Watcher 22 is still watching. I used to live in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind where everyone knew each other and nothing ever seemed to happen. It was the perfect place for someone like me, a freelance graphic designer who enjoyed the peace and solitude that came with working from home. Little did I know that this seemingly perfect environment would soon become the setting for the most horrifying experience of my life. It all started on a chilly autumn evening. I was working late, as usual, trying to meet a tight deadline for a client. The house was eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustling of leaves outside and the hum of my computer. Around midnight, I decided to take a break and make myself a cup of coffee. As I walked to the kitchen, I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was off. I glanced out the window, but all I could see was the dimly lit street and the shadows of trees swaying in the wind. I returned to my office and continued working, but the uneasy feeling lingered. An hour later, I heard a faint noise coming from the backyard. It sounded like a twig snapping. I froze, listening intently. There it was again, only louder this time. My heart began to race as I crept to the window and peered outside. In the darkness, I could barely make out the silhouette of a person standing near the fence. Panic surged through me. I quickly grabbed my phone and dialed 911, whispering my address to the operator. They assured me that a patrol car was on its way. I stayed on the line, trying to keep my voice steady, when suddenly, the figure disappeared from sight. A moment later, I heard the unmistakable sound of a window being pried open in the living room. My blood ran cold. I knew I had to hide. I grabbed a kitchen knife and quietly made my way to the bedroom closet. I crouched inside, holding my breath, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure it would give me away. I could hear the intruder moving through the house, his footsteps slow and deliberate, as if he was taking his time to savor the moment. The footsteps grew louder, and I realized he was heading toward my bedroom. I squeezed my eyes shut, clutching the knife so tightly my knuckles turned white. The bedroom door creaked open, and I could hear the intruder's heavy breathing. He seemed to stand still for a moment, and then the closet door slowly began to slide open. In that instant, I sprang out, screaming and brandishing the knife. The intruder, taken aback, stumbled backward and fled the room. I could hear him running down the hall and out the back door. Moments later, the police arrived. They searched the house and the yard but found no sign of the intruder. They assured me they would patrol the area more frequently and advised me to install a security system. The next few days were a blur of anxiety and paranoia. I barely slept, jumping at every little noise. I installed a state-of-the-art security system, complete with cameras and motion detectors. For a while, it seemed to help. I started to feel a bit safer, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. One night, about a week after the break-in, I was jolted awake by the sound of my security alarm blaring. I leaped out of bed and checked the live feed on my phone. My heart sank as I saw a masked figure standing in the middle of my living room, staring directly at the camera. I immediately called the police and watched in terror as the intruder slowly walked out of view. The police arrived within minutes, but once again, the intruder was gone. They reviewed the footage but couldn't identify the man. They suggested it might be a prank or someone trying to scare me. I wasn't convinced. I felt like I was being hunted. Determined to catch the intruder, I set up additional cameras and motion-activated lights around the house. I even started sleeping with the lights on. But the intrusions continued. The alarms would go off at random times, and each time the police would find nothing. I was starting to lose my mind. One night, as I sat in my office trying to work, I heard a faint tapping on the window. My blood ran cold as I slowly turned to look. There, on the other side of the glass, was a face. It was the intruder, wearing the same mask, staring at me with hollow, soulless eyes. I screamed and ran for the front door, but as I fumbled with the lock, I realized the figure was now standing in the hallway. I don't know how he got inside, but I knew I had to get out. I ran to the back door, threw it open, and sprinted into the night. I didn't stop running until I reached my neighbor's house. Banging on their door, I screamed for help. They let me in and called the police. They promised to increase patrols in the area, but their reassurances did little to ease my fear. In the days that followed, I became hyper-vigilant. Every stranger on the street seemed like a potential threat, every shadow a hiding place for my stalker. I started having nightmares again, waking up in a cold sweat, My work began to suffer, and my friends noticed the change in me. They tried to be supportive, but I could see the worry and doubt in their eyes. One night, I decided to take matters into my own hands. Armed with pepper spray and a baseball bat, I sat in the dark, waiting for the intruder to show himself. Hours passed, and just when I was about to give up, I heard a noise from the living room. My heart pounded in my chest as I crept down the hallway, bat raised, ready to confront whoever was in my home. But when I reached the living room, it was empty. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator. I was about to turn around when I noticed something on the coffee table, a single white envelope. With trembling hands, I opened it, revealing a photograph of me asleep in my bed. On the back, written in neat block letters, were the words, "I'm always watching." I dropped the photograph and backed away, my mind racing. How had he gotten inside? I checked the locks, the windows. Everything was secure. The police were called once again, and once again they found nothing. No fingerprints, no sign of forced entry, nothing. Feeling defeated, I decided to take a leave of absence from work and stay with a friend for a while. I needed to get away, to clear my head and figure out what to do next. My friend Emily was incredibly understanding and offered me her spare room. For the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. Emily lived in a different part of the city, a much safer neighborhood, and her presence was a comfort. We spent the days talking, laughing, and trying to regain a sense of normalcy. But the nights were still difficult. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even in Emily's home. One evening, as we were having dinner, Emily's phone rang. She excused herself to take the call, leaving me alone in the dining room. A few minutes later, she returned, looking pale and shaken. "That was the police," she said, her voice trembling. "They found a body in the park near your house." My heart skipped a beat. "Do they know who it is?" I asked, dread creeping into my voice. Emily nodded. "They think it's the man who's been stalking you. They found his ID on him. His name was Robert King." The news should have brought relief, but instead it filled me with an overwhelming sense of dread. "How did he die?" I asked, already fearing the answer. Emily hesitated. "They said it looked like he'd been there for a while, but they're not sure how he died. It's like he just stopped." I felt a chill run down my spine. Robert King was dead, but my ordeal was far from over. That night I had the worst nightmare yet. I was back in my old house, trapped, with no way out. The walls seemed to close in on me, and I could hear Robert's voice, whispering my name over and over. I woke up screaming, drenched in sweat. Emily rushed into the room trying to calm me down. As I recounted the nightmare, I noticed something on the nightstand, a small white envelope. My hands trembled as I picked it up. Inside was another photograph of me, this time in Emily's house, asleep in the spare room. On the back, the words, "You can't escape me," were written. We called the police and they arrived quickly, but there was no sign of forced entry. No fingerprints, no clues, just the chilling photograph. The police promised to keep an eye on Emily's house, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. They thought I was losing my mind, and maybe I was. The next few days were a blur of anxiety and fear. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. I was constantly on edge, jumping at every little sound. Emily tried to be supportive, but I could see the strain it was putting on her. She suggested I see a therapist, but I knew that no amount of therapy could fix what I was experiencing. One night, as I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, I heard a faint whisper. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but the whisper grew louder, more insistent. It was Robert's voice repeating the same phrase over and over. "You can't escape me." I bolted upright, my heart pounding. The room was dark, but I could see a figure standing in the corner, just out of reach of the moonlight. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shaking. The figure stepped forward and I could see his face. Robert's face, pale and ghostly.
"You know who I am,"
he said, his voice cold and hollow.
"I'm the one who's been watching you."
I felt a scream rising in my throat, but I couldn't make a sound. Robert moved closer, his eyes empty and lifeless.
You can't escape me.
He repeated, reaching out to touch my face. Just as his fingers brushed my skin, I woke up gasping for air. It had been a nightmare, but it felt so real. I could still feel the cold touch of his hand on my cheek. I glanced around the room, my heart racing, but there was no one there. I knew then that I couldn't stay with Emily any longer. I had to face this nightmare head-on, confront whatever was haunting me. I packed my things and returned to my house, determined to find answers. The first night back was the hardest. I sat in the living room, clutching the photograph Robert had left, trying to make sense of everything. As the hours passed, I began to feel a strange sense of calm. I wasn't alone anymore. I had faced my fear and survived. But as the night wore on, I heard a familiar sound, the tapping on the window. I turned slowly, my heart pounding, and saw Robert's face staring back at me. This time, I didn't scream. I walked to the window, opened it, and faced him. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, my voice steady. Robert's face twisted into a grotesque smile.
Because you let me in,
he said.
And now you can never escape.
With that, he disappeared into the night, leaving me alone with my fear. I realized then that the true horror wasn't Robert himself, but the darkness he had brought into my life. It was a darkness that I would have to live with, a constant reminder that sometimes the real monsters aren't the ones we can see, but the ones that lurk within our minds. When I was a teenager, the events that transpired at Crestwood High School left an indelible mark on my psyche. I'm now in my 50s, but the memories of that time are as vivid as if they happened yesterday. It's been 35 years since that dreadful night, and not a day goes by that I don't think about it. Maybe sharing this story will help me finally put it to rest, though I doubt that's possible. Crestwood High was a typical American high school nestled in the sleepy town of Millfield. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and nothing out of the ordinary ever seemed to happen. That was until my senior year. It all started with the arrival of a new teacher, Mr. Elwood. He was an odd man with pale skin, piercing blue eyes, and a demeanor that sent shivers down your spine. He taught history, and from the moment he walked into our classroom, there was something off about him. I remember the first day he introduced himself. His voice was low and raspy, almost as if he was struggling to speak. He had an unsettling way of looking at you, as if he could see right through you. Despite his strange aura, he quickly became a favorite among students for his gripping storytelling skills. He had a knack for making history come alive, often delving into the macabre and bizarre events of the past with an enthusiasm that was both captivating and unnerving. One day, Mr. Elwood announced that he was starting a history club. He invited anyone interested in learning more about the darker side of history to join. Naturally, a group of us, curious and eager for something different, signed up. Little did we know this decision would lead us down a path of unimaginable terror. The club meetings were held in the basement of the school, a place that had always given me the creeps. It was dimly lit, with old creaky wooden floors and an odd musty smell that permeated the air. The basement had been unused for years, and it felt like stepping into another world. Mr. Elwood insisted it was the perfect place for our meetings, as it added to the atmosphere of the stories he was about to share. During our first meeting, Mr. Elwood told us about a local legend that none of us had ever heard before. The story of Mary Whitfield, a young girl who had attended Crestwood High in the 1950s. According to Mr. Elwood, Mary was a shy, introverted student who was often bullied by her classmates. One day she mysteriously disappeared, and no one ever saw her again. Rumors circulated that she had run away, but others believed something far more sinister had happened. Mr. Elwood claimed that Mary's spirit still haunted the school, seeking revenge on those who wronged her. He described sightings of a ghostly figure roaming the halls at night, her mournful wails echoing through the empty corridors. As he spoke, a chill ran down my spine. I glanced around at my friends. and it was clear they felt the same unease. Over the next few weeks, Mr. Elwood continued to share more about Mary and other dark tales from the town's history. Each story seemed more disturbing than the last, but we were all hooked. The thrill of fear became addictive. Then, one night, Mr. Elwood suggested we conduct a seance to try and communicate with Mary's spirit. We all hesitated, but our curiosity got the better of us, and we reluctantly agreed. We gathered in the basement late one Friday night, the air thick with tension. Mr. Elwood had brought candles and an old Ouija board. He instructed us to sit in a circle, holding hands, and to focus our minds on Mary. As we began, a sense of dread washed over me. The candles flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls, and the temperature seemed to drop. Mr. Elwood started chanting softly, his voice growing louder and more insistent with each passing second. The planchette on the Ouija board began to move, slowly at first, then more rapidly. We watched in silent horror as it spelled out a message. "I am here." A cold breeze swept through the room, extinguishing the candles and plunging us into darkness. Panic set in, and we scrambled to find the light switch. When the lights flickered back on, Mr. Elwood was gone. We searched the basement, calling out his name, but there was no trace of him. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. The following Monday, Mr. Elwood didn't show up for class. The school administration said he had resigned suddenly and left town, but something about their explanation didn't sit right with me. My friends and I were haunted by what had happened, and we vowed never to speak of it again. A few nights later, I was awoken by a strange noise coming from the hallway outside my bedroom. I listened closely, my heart pounding, and heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slowly, I got out of bed and crept towards the door, my hands trembling. As I opened it, I was met with a chilling sight: Mary Whitfield standing at the end of the hall, her eyes hollow and lifeless. She stared at me for what felt like an eternity, then disappeared into the darkness. I barely slept that night, and when I finally drifted off, my dreams were filled with her tormented face. The next day at school, my friends and I shared similar experiences. It became clear that we had unleashed something terrible, and there was no escaping it. The sightings continued over the next few weeks, growing more frequent and more terrifying. Mary's spirit seemed to be everywhere, lurking in the shadows, watching us from a distance. We were all on edge, constantly looking over our shoulders, but no one else seemed to notice anything unusual. One night I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to return to the basement and try to set things right. Armed with a flashlight and a growing sense of dread, I made my way to the school. The halls were eerily silent, and the air felt heavy with an unseen presence. As I descended the stairs to the basement, the temperature dropped and I could see my breath in the air. I entered the basement, my flashlight casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. I called out to Mary, my voice trembling. "Mary, if you're here, I'm sorry for what we did. We didn't mean to disturb you. Please, let us go." For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, the planchette on the Ouija board moved, spelling out a single word: help. My heart raced as I realized that Mary wasn't seeking revenge. She was trapped, and she needed our help to move on. I spent the next few hours trying to communicate with her, asking how we could free her spirit. She guided me to an old, forgotten locker at the back of the basement. Inside, I found a dusty box filled with her belongings, photos, letters, and a diary. As I read through the diary, the truth of her disappearance became clear. Mary hadn't run away. She had been murdered by one of her tormentors, a popular athlete named Jack Henderson. Her body had been hidden in the basement, sealed behind a false wall. I was horrified by the revelation, but I knew what I had to do. I reported my findings to the police, who investigated and eventually found Mary's remains. Jack Henderson, now a successful businessman, was arrested and brought to justice. Mary's spirit finally found peace, and the sightings ceased. But the experience left its mark on me. Even now, decades later, I can still feel her presence. Sometimes late at night, I hear her footsteps echoing in the hallway, a reminder of the darkness that once haunted Crestwood High. The events of that year changed me forever, and I've never been able to escape the shadow of Mary Whitfield. As I sit here, recounting this story, I can't help but feel that something is watching me. The air grows cold and the lights flicker. I glance up and there she is, Mary standing in the corner of the room, her eyes filled with sorrow. I realize now that some spirits can never truly be at rest, and some stories never truly end. The memories flood back in waves, crashing against my sanity. I've tried to move on, to live a normal life, but the events of that year are always with me, lurking in the shadows. Crestwood High may have moved on, but for those of us who were there, the scars remain. In my early 20s, I moved to a small town in Oregon. I had always been a skeptic about the paranormal, but my friend Nate was into ghost hunting and exploring abandoned places. One evening, he convinced me and our friend Sarah to check out an old house on Maple Street, rumored to be haunted. It was a cold October night, perfect for a spooky adventure. We met at Nate's place around 11 p.m. and drove to the house. The place was decrepit, with broken windows and overgrown weeds. Nate had brought along a Ouija board, much to my dismay. He insisted it would make the experience more thrilling. We climbed through a broken window and found ourselves in a dusty living room. The furniture was covered in white sheets, and cobwebs hung from the ceiling. We set up the Ouija board in the center of the room and lit a few candles. The flickering light cast long, eerie shadows. Nate took charge and asked the first question.
Is anyone here with us?
The planchette moved to yes. I felt a chill run down my spine. Sarah asked,
What's your name?
The board spelled Abigail. Nate, ever the thrill-seeker, asked,
How did you die?
The planchette spelled murder. The tension in the room was strong. I asked,
Who killed you?
The planchette didn't move. We sat in silence for a moment, the air thick with unease. Suddenly, we heard a loud thump from upstairs. We all jumped, and Sarah gasped. Nate insisted we check it out, but I was hesitant. We cautiously climbed the creaky stairs, each step amplifying the dread. At the top, we saw a door slightly ajar. Nate pushed it open, revealing a dusty old bedroom. The furniture was overturned, and there was a large, dark stain on the floor that looked suspiciously like dried blood. We heard another thump, this time from behind a closed door at the end of the hall. I was really nervous as Nate approached the door. He opened it slowly, and we saw a narrow staircase leading to the attic. We hesitated, but Nate was determined. We followed him up the stairs, the narrow space making it feel like the walls were closing in on us. In the attic, we found old trunks and boxes covered in dust. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind us, and the temperature dropped dramatically. We heard whispers, but really too faint to make out the words. Sarah clutched my arm, and I could feel her trembling. Nate, trying to be brave, asked aloud,
Abigail, are you here?
The whispers grew louder, and we could now understand them.
Leave. Now.
We didn't need any more encouragement. We bolted down the stairs and out of the house, not stopping until we were safely outside. As we caught our breath, we noticed the Ouija board was still in the living room, the planchette at goodbye. Nate retrieved it, and we decided to never speak of the night again. We later learned that the house had belonged to a family in the early 1900s. Abigail was the daughter who had been murdered by an intruder. Her spirit was said to haunt the place, seeking justice. I haven't been on any ghost hunts since that night. The experience left me shaken, and while I still don't fully believe in the paranormal, I'm not as skeptical as I used to be. Some things are better left unexplored. That's all for tonight's bone-chilling story. Leave a comment with your thoughts, and if you've got a scarier tale, send it in. And don't forget to check under your bed. This is Mr. Scary Guy saying, good night and beware.